started. Sorry, we're starting a few minutes late, so we'll go until about 5 after 2, just because we're starting late. But if you have to leave early or in the middle or whenever, all the side doors are open, so feel free to just duck out if you need. No problem. Also, if you haven't been here before, the washrooms are just down this hall. There's a door you go through, and then the washrooms are right there. Okay, so I'm Angie Schick. I'm the director of the New Ventures BC organization, most known, of course, for the competition. So thanks for joining us today. We're a not-for-profit society, and we've been running our competition. This is our 19th year. But we also, for the last 5 years, have run a distance accelerator, and we also have a job grant program called the Innovator Skills Initiative, great acronym, ISI. And basically, if you put in $5,000, up to $5,000 to hire a post-secondary student, we will match whatever you put in. So you basically are getting half for half. So if you're looking at hiring a student anytime soon, come on in. Let us know. We'll tell you more about the program. All right, for those coming in, there's seats here, there's some seats at the back. There's also some pizza at the back. There's still some there. Okay, so otherwise, so today is corporate structure. That's going to take us to a little bit after 2, like I said, and then we're going to have a little bit of a break. For those who are in the competition, at 3 o'clock, we have Alex Greenville. She's a past winner. She's going to come in and go through all the round 2 questions for those doing this submission due on Monday. If you're not in the competition, it might be interesting, but not really. So don't bother to stay for that. But if you are, you're welcome to leave, come back, and stay if you want. So I'm going to thank my sponsors, and I'm going to hand it over to, we have 3 lawyers at Baskets. We have John Conway, Freddie Gill, and Steve Seville. They're going to walk you through your corporate. So our title sponsor is Innovate BC. Our lead sponsors are EY, Baskin, thank you for hosting us, as always, Van City, and the SFUB School of Business. Come on in. Silver sponsors are Talos Ventures, Vantech Angel Forum, Spring, UBC Sauder School of Business, and newly joined AccelerX, which is a life sciences accelerator that's Canada-wide. Bronze sponsors are Ace Tech, BC Tech Association, WebNames.ca, Fred Thunder, Media, Foresight, National PR, Pusher, Status Bureau. We have lots of friends. I love having lots of friends. That's it for me. I'm going to hand it over to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. So my name is John Conlon, and we'll probably do a quick intro about each of us so you know who you're talking to. I'm a partner in our securities and technology group with a focus on technology companies, and within that, I do mostly the business and corporate side, corporate finance side of tech companies. So what does that mean? Everything from screen.
Can you guys hear at the back? Good? Okay, everybody, sorry.
Everything from helping companies form, helping founders turn their ideas into a business, all the way up to very complex financings with venture capital firms, M&A activity, buy and sell side in the hundreds of millions and up. So it's a very diverse practice, and very very happy to be able to talk to folks like yourselves that are forming companies or down the path a little bit and want to know more.
Hi, my name is Freddie Gill, and I'm a tax associate in our tax group. My practice is fairly general. It's all within tax, and so I do a lot of work with tax planning, so structuring organizations, or planning transactions and restructuring and so on. So within my practice also is like some elements of personal tax planning, and but mostly it's yeah, so I work a lot with the tech group because some of the issues that are involved that we discussed here are specific to startups and smaller companies in the tech sector. So.
I'm Steve Seville. I'm a partner in their securities and M&A group. I started out in Toronto, and when I was in Toronto, I did a lot of public company work, and in moving back to Vancouver, I still kept that part of my practice. So I do about half public company work, which is both the going public transaction, IPO, or what we see a lot of is RTOs onto one of the stock exchanges, and then sort of ongoing financing for public companies. And then the other half is private company stuff, both M&A and financing for tech companies and other private companies.
That's Great, so that was us, a little bit about the firm, just to do a shameless plug. So Fasken is a national firm with offices internationally as well, London, South Africa, presence in China as well. And what's relevant for all of you folks is that Fasken and our Vancouver office specifically is a very big focus on the technology industry. We're the largest firm in Vancouver and in British Columbia. Within that, diverse set of practice areas, but tech specific, I would say that our tech group, which is 15 strong, is supported by a large number of other practice groups that have developed expertise for technology companies. What I mean by that is we have our tax experts like Hardeep, we have employment experts that handle issues both general and specific to technology companies. We have litigators that handle the enforcement side of disputes between businesses or disputes with personnel that you have. And so we have a very strong offering across the board for early stage companies all the way through to complex, multi-hundred employee companies. So that's us.
So our presentation today is going to focus on two areas, corporate structure and legal agreements. When we're talking about corporate structure, there's lots of options for forming a business organization. We'll talk about the different types there are. In the tech space, it's almost always going to be a corporation that you want, but we will talk about different ways of doing it, where to do it, as well as how financing structures for private companies work and how they generally flow. We'll also talk about some of the principal agreements that startup companies deal with. Again, if you're taking in investors, there's always shareholder agreements, IP assignment agreements, making sure that anybody that works with you is effectively getting their IP into the company. Employment and consulting agreements, if you don't do it right or if you don't think about it in advance, they can be a major, major headache down the road dealing with employees and what their entitlements may be in common law if you don't have them prescribed by contract. Term sheets, reverse vesting agreements, lots of, these are the principal agreements that you'll be dealing with in a startup or initial launch of the business. Pass it back to John.
So options for association. So we're including this slide almost as just to be complete, but the conclusion that we'll reach very quickly is that there are only one or two options that are hopefully relevant for your business organization. But there are many ways you could structure a business. You could be a sole proprietor, thinking of yourself as self-employed. The problem with that is that you have a very hard time shielding yourself from liabilities associated with your business. You have a very hard time receiving outside investment. You have a very hard time managing a large group of employees and other, ordinary corporate growth problems or opportunities that a business has. So I find that extremely rare. Yeah.
Your sound is cut off on the back.
So, we're not still on.
Is it hard to hear?
Can you hear the back?
Okay.
You can hear me, but can you hear him?
Can you hear me?
No, yes.
No, okay. Partnerships, many of you have at least some familiarity with partnerships. There's two general formats for a partnership. One is a general partnership where both partners are carrying on a business with view to profit and both are responsible for the liabilities, debts, obligations of the partnership, and those are unlimited, joint and several in nature. You can also have a limited partnership where the liabilities are on one or more partners, but the other partners have limited liability. And you may see through the news or in your experience with investment groups like VCs that many structure their investment vehicles as limited partnerships for tax reasons and structuring reasons for why that's appropriate. But I would say at a high level, and due to the amount of material we have to get through, we're not going to go into great detail, but I would caution you strongly if you're trying to come up with an exotic organizational structure that's outside of the typical corporate organization. Joint ventures, you often hear of people carrying on a joint venture, and what that means from our perspective is two or more parties that are joint on a specific project, and perhaps over a set period of time, there's a very defined set of obligations and responsibilities and the investment of capital and other resources to that project. And then also the splitting of expenses, revenues, things like that with a predetermined formula. Again, we typically find that appropriate for kind of a one-off project between two existing businesses and not for a startup company per se. That brings us to corporations. There's a reason why everybody from, the FANG companies all the way down to startups you see, in competitions like this are structured as a corporation. And that's because of the ease with which a corporation provides a lot of flexibility for growth, allows you to receive outside capital, allows founders, allows the ownership of IP to be very clear, allows founders to kind of delineate their ownership interests in a very clear manner, not only for themselves, but when they're going out to investors and saying, this is the company, this is what the company owns, this is the portion we each own, and this is what we're going to structure, for example, financing as. And so we typically see companies incorporated in either British Columbia or federally, but there are also opportunities to have international incorporation. And when you see that is typically as a subsidiary that's operating in another country, and you need that subsidiary to be in that country to then, for example, employ the people you have in that country. And we can answer questions that you have on that question period.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is if you're departing from a corporation, there's got to be very, very, very good reasons. And even then, we would probably want to hear about them because there's so much of the way it's set up that's to the benefit of using corporate structure. Oops, I skipped one. So we'll talk a bit about a corporate structure. Just I don't know how many people know about it and how much this is review, but there's kind of a hierarchy, and people sometimes maybe not understand how the hierarchy necessarily works. Shareholders, when we draw this out, they're at the top of the chain. They can be anybody. It can be people, it can be companies, it can be partnerships. Any entity really can be a shareholder, right? So shareholders, they elect the board of directors. They've got to have basically the right to vote and the right to receive dividends and to the extent declared, and a right to an interest in wind up, but otherwise have no involvement in the management of the company or the risks of the company. Directors, there's a board of directors. They, depending on the company, they'll become a bit more involved, but typically their job is to hire and supervise management. And management is your CEO, your C-level, C-suite people. So shareholders elect directors, directors hire managers, officers, and then the officers hire the employees, the other employees. And from a reporting structure, the employees will report to the CEO or the CFO or whoever it may be. The CEO or CFO will report to the board, and the board reports to the shareholders at the annual meeting each year. So there's downward, that's how it works down, and that's how it works back up. So as I said, shareholders can be anybody. We'll get into it. Directors have to be people. Directors have to be people, but shareholders can be anybody. So you could have a company invest in you, you could have an individual invest, you could have a partnership invest. You can have as many as you want. There's no restriction on the number of shareholders. Public companies have thousands and thousands of shareholders. There's an important thing to know in Canada is that if you are under 50 shareholders, you're what's called a private issuer under securities laws. And if you go over 50 shareholders, you're no longer a private issuer. And this is often confused. If you're no longer a private issuer, it doesn't mean you're a public company. So the public company, nobody becomes a public company accidentally. You have to file a prospectus or do a transaction with the public company. But you can go over 50 shareholders. The consequence of no longer being a private issuer is that future share issuances to investors, you need to file with the BC Securities Commission. So
does an angel syndicate count as one person or all the people that are in the syndicate?
Is it an angel corporation?
Angel syndicate? You know what I mean? Like if you're getting angel investments from a syndicate, does that count as a single?
That typically does, yeah. And I think if the key is if it was set up for that particular investment, there'll likely be a bit of a look through. Like if you bought, then you'd 10 people together just to try to shrink your numbers, that the Securities Commission would look through that. But if it had a legitimate business purpose and had a number of shareholders, then I think that would be fine. When we're talking syndicate, we mean they're investing through one entity or through?
Yeah, so you have angel syndicate groups that are out there that
Yeah.
have thousands of
Yeah.
angel investors who jump on board a deal.
One shareholder.
Even E-Fund or somebody that's a syndicate in our market is still investing through corporation. The word syndicate itself is hard.
So it's just, one more.
What about if you're raising a friends and family round? Like, are there any special regulations with your mom or?
Yeah, and I'll get into that, we've got a section on that, but they would still, for what I'm talking about right now, if you've got 50 family members in it, once you're over 50, you're into filing reports. But you can have as many as you have. So shareholders, just make sure, yeah, that's the right slide. So no liability, you can lose what you invested, but you can't lose more than your investment. Whereas if you're a partnership and partnership gets sued, you can lose your house, right? So this is, you put in your money, you get a share, limited liability. There's lots of different things that sort of happen within the shareholder structure. Common shares, that's what all the public companies eventually all go back to common shares, right? Like for the most part, other the banks, I guess. But that's sort of the core investment. As you're going through the investment cycle, some strategic investors or the VCs or whatnot, where it's a high risk investment or sometimes looking for preferred rights, preferred voting, preferred dividends, preferred liquidity preference. That's all stuff you can do within a corporation, and it's stuff that you sometimes have to do to be able to raise the money to get on to the next round. But the less complicated you are, like before you see your VCs, if you're just common shares, it's going to make things a lot easier and smoother for the new investor to assess your corporate structure. So, shareholders, they have the exclusive right to the directors. Preemptive rights are something that can be bargained for. There's no right to them, but that's something we often see when an investor comes in. They don't want to buy in at 10 cents or $10 a share and have you turn around the next day and start issuing at $1 a share again. It allows them to participate if there's a down round and you have the benefit of a lower price. And the relationship between shareholders and the company is set out in the articles as maybe supplemented by a shareholders agreement and any rights that are bargained for in the subscription agreement when they start their investment.
Am I still good at the back? I tried it one more time, I'm sure. You hear me? Okay, thanks. So just some of which will be a little bit of repetition, but to dive into kind of the structure a little bit more. So again, policy setters and directors. And directors usually have a part-time role, they're not full-time, but what you find is, and what you're probably thinking when we're going through some of the breakdowns of different roles is, well, hold on a second, I'm all of those people, I'm wearing 3 hats right now. It's totally fine, of course, right? Many startups begin as one person, and that's absolutely expected. But some of what we're talking about is as you grow, what is typically seen in respect of each of these buckets, right? So what we find as a company grows is that directors have a part-time role, and although if we're looking at one of our larger venture-backed companies, we do see that the CEO is on the board representing management as is appropriate, but you'll also find independent directors, industry experts, you'll find representatives of major investors on the board. You can even see strategic investors having a board member as well. So there's a lot of different types of directors, how they perhaps got their board seat, but that's generally the breakdown. So again, directors are elected by shareholders. And if it's a VC company, there's no residency requirement, as you saw in one of our first slides. There's the difference between a federal company and a VC company. You're probably thinking, well, what are the differences between those? Well, one of them is that if it's VC, there's no residency requirement, whereas if it's a federal company, then you need at least 25% of the board to be Canadian resident, sorry. So there's a lot of, as you start to tease out, some of the differences between these. It becomes very complicated, but that's one that people often run into. Qualifications, you need to be over 18, you can't be a criminal, and you can't be a bankrupt, so hopefully that qualifies most of us in this room. No ceiling on the number of directors other than a practical limit. We find that early on with one, decisions, perhaps they convince some angel investors to invest in them, and we'll get to what that looks like later. And that person joins the board, and then as they grow, like I mentioned, there's different board seats that can be filled.
I think it's often good to have an odd number of directors. That way you've got a tie-breaking vote in disputes.
What you'll find is that as you grow, and a lot of these roles are locked in by contract, so as a function of one of your financings, you'll enter into a shareholder agreement if you haven't already done so at your foundation. And that shareholder agreement will say everybody agrees that the board is this. So the AGM is extremely anticlimactic in that respect. So the next slide expands a little bit more on what directors do, as Steve mentioned. So what I would highlight in this slide is that directors have a fiduciary duty to the company to act in the best interest of the company fairly and diligently. What that often means is that directors are limited in what they can do with respect to things like taking corporate opportunities for themselves or acting in a manner that is at odds with their duty to the company. And sometimes you'll find directors get in a hot spot if they're an investor nominee, so they're thinking, well, which hat am I wearing right now? Am I acting in the best interest of the investor in this company, the one that wants a return on their investment, or am I wearing my hat as a board member of this company acting in its best interest? And directors have to be very careful walking that fine line.
Yeah, so just wondering that whether all the members in the board, they had all of directly right, regardless of the number of years.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, so each board member has one vote on the board, and their power at the board level is irrespective of their the number of shares that they might hold or that the investor that nominated them might hold. There's always going to be a caveat because we're lawyers and we can never answer a question directly. So what you may find is back in our shareholders agreement, you may find a provision that says, you can't go raise more than $1 million in debt unless the board approves it. But the board, that approval needs to include person X that's a nominee of the investor, meaning that they have a blocker on an action. So you may find that by virtue of contract, there's blockers that are on certain actions. But to answer your question, simply as possible, yeah, the answer is yes. Many directors are try to keep top of mind when they can be personally liable for things. So it could be a breach of a duty like I touched on. But the two big ones are unpaid taxes and unpaid wages to your employees. So those are the two examples where board members could be found personally liable. And as Steve mentioned, directors appoint officers. So that moves us to the officers, which we've called the instructors. Officers appointed by the directors, as many as you want, again, just subject to practicality. And it can be any title you want. Typically, things are kept quite simple at the beginning, but as you may have seen from some companies, you've got chief innovation officers, you've got chief evangelists, things like that. So people are creative these days, and they're in charge of the day-to-day affairs of the company. Because lawyers have no creativity, this one's called the doers, and that's the employees. So the employees are the ones, I'm sure I'll get yelled at by CEOs and others, but the employees are the ones that are realizing on the business plan, and Steve will do this.
Thank you. Excuse me. So a few things about employees, I guess. These are people that you hire them, you get to tell them what to do. They're meant to carry out functions that are delegated to them under their employment agreement or by their management. If you don't put a fixed term on an employment agreement, they run. So if you're fine with that, that's fine. They'll run. And I sometimes deal with this with people from time to time. Not an employment lawyer, but I think we all kind of get questions from time to time. if it's not working out with an employee, you can always get rid of an employee, right? Nobody has an entitlement to a lifetime of work from any particular employer. So it's, it's something you have to deal with. It's just a question of how much you owe them from a severance, sort of note their payment in lieu of notice. That's effectively what we call it. So and then there's statutory obligations, and then there's common law obligations. And the statute prescribes, something, 2 weeks once you've been there a year, and then every time thereafter. Common law can prescribe a whole lot more than that. If it's, somebody that's put a lot of time into it, in common law, it's sort of around, how long will it take them to find another equivalent job? And, part of it depends on what the position is, part of it depends on how old they are, part of it, it's a whole contextual analysis. So if you want to avoid that contextual analysis, enter into employment agreements with people and say, we hereby agree that, if there's a termination, we will use the statutory framework for assessing what the amount of payment should be. Very, very important thing, because if you do that, you can quantify it. If you don't have an employment agreement, there is not going to be any way to quantify it, and it's a very loose negotiation, and you can, anyway, I hope you get the point, but it's worthwhile thinking about. Other important things for employment agreements: confidentiality. Assignment of intellectual property is huge, right? Like, there's a lot of sort of the historical law about an inventor having ownership rights in their own invention, and moral rights in terms of how it's used, and things like that. If you don't address the assignment of moral rights and intellectual property in the employment agreement or in an IP assignment agreement, you're not going to have them. And when you go to do an investment round, or when you go to sell the company, the person that comes along and is kicking the tires is going to want to see all that stuff in hand. And if it's not there, there's going to be concerns about how tight your ownership of the IP is. So really, think about that. Ideally, you do it at the outset. If you don't, you do it as soon as you realize that this is an issue. When you don't want to be doing it is when somebody's going to write you a big check on the basis you get it done, because then whoever you need to sign this thing has a ton of leverage, right? It may or may not sign. So do it at the outset before anybody has leverage over you. Non-competition and non-solicitation are also very important things to address in employment agreements. One sort of key thing particularly on the non-competition thing is like long-term, broadly drafted non-competition agreements will not be enforced. So if you say 5 years, anywhere, it's not going to be enforced. If you have a narrow, well-drafted non-competition agreement, it likely will be enforced. So think about, how much, I think most of our employment lawyers would say 6 months to a year, likely, probably pretty good. And then in terms of, territory, it should be restricted to the territory that you currently operate in, or sort of, your contemplated expansion area. But, if you're just in Vancouver and you say, anywhere in the world, you don't have a non-competition agreement anymore. And you have, I guess, the threat to sue, but you don't have anything that can be enforced. So another good area to get advice. Yeah.
Would you suggest an agreement for contractors as well, or just payroll?
Yes, just flip the slide. So consultants, you have almost all the same issues, right?
Explain non-solicitation.
Okay, so normally it revolves around two things. One, going after customers. Two, going after employees. So you're normally going to have something in there that says, for a period of time, they're not able to solicit any employees for work, or they're not able to solicit any customers. And again, you don't say that when they leave. So these are areas where it's worth putting in a bit of time and money to make sure you get it right, because this is the type of stuff that's really going to protect your business going forward.
And non-solicitation is much more enforceable. If you think of the principal basis difference between the two, right? One is allowing somebody to earn a living with what they know how to do, and the other one is preventing people from, leveraging their former role to steal customers or try to steal your people. It's a lot different for a court if you think of enforceability.
I mean, non-solicitation, just by definition, is a little much more specific, because it's basically what the.
Yeah, I saw the other day a non-competition where they're basically asserting that somebody could no longer be an accountant anymore. And like, that's just not gonna happen, right? So the non-competition really has to be. So consultants, you have a lot of the same issues. The main, thing, I guess, is, people often do this sort of stuff because, for tax reasons, they want to be able to not have, source deductions taken, they'll do their own deductions and whatnot. The CRA, looks through these things. So if you have somebody that is showing up every single day, working on your equipment, that sort of thing, they're gonna be deemed to be an employee, even if they technically call themselves a consultant. So, I think companies tend to accommodate that characterization by people on the basis that there's an indemnification in the consulting agreement that says, if for any reason you are reclassified, you're going to pay us, and you're going to give us all this money so that we can make those deductions that the CRA is now telling us that we should have been able to fund. Yeah.
What happened if an employee actually had signed a non-competition contract with his employers, and he wants to work for the other company, so he creates a consultant company, protected himself with an LLP, and then he works for that company as a consultant? Is there any legal?
I think, these things are always pretty fact specific. There's the general principle in law is you can't do indirectly what you would be able to do directly. So if somebody, if the spirit of the thing, of the agreement that you had entered into was to cover certain actions by you, setting yourself up in a particular structure to try to evade that is unlikely to be much of a defense. And then, in consulting, the same sorts of things address all of the key elements that you care about: the confidentiality, assignment of IP, non-competition, and non-solicitation in consulting agreements to the same extent you would in employment agreements. Over to Harvey. Thank you.
As Steve mentioned, tax bears a large, the decision as to whether somebody's a consultant or an employee often bears on tax quite a bit. And so the issue is that the CRA will look at the relationship irrespective of what the agreement says. And so they'll see whether this person is showing up to work, whether this person is being told what to do, how to do it, where to do it, when to do it, all of this stuff, what tools are being used, whether this person has a fixed salary versus not a fixed salary. If the person is getting the profit, then that's more likely a consultant. And whether this person has any risk under the agreement. So if it turns out that all of those factors points towards employee, despite that the agreement says something different, then CRA is still going to find that this person's an employee. So that said, the agreement kind of sets out what the analysis is, and it's extremely important even for tax purposes to have one. And so when it comes down to it, you can at least hang your hat on something and say, well, this is why this person was a consultant, not an employee. So it's very important to have. The reason why it's important is because with respect to employees, their employers have to take source deductions, have to pay CPP, EI, workers' comp, and so on. Whereas with consultants, they're running their own business. So consultants don't have to, anything that's paid to them, that's revenue for them, for their business. And so they, nobody else is going to deduct tax with some key exceptions, in respect to a consultant. So then, the consultant is supposed to account for the tax themselves, and they're responsible for doing so. To do it correctly. So compensation and incentives generally. Yes.
Directors have to be employees for their directors' fees, right?
So that's a complicated question. For tax purposes, The operating provision in the Act says that any person that holds an office or is an employee is subject to the employment remuneration provisions. And so the Act differentiates between an employee and somebody who's a director, because the director is someone who holds office. Generally, I'm not exactly.
So from a corporate employment perspective, they're not gonna be an employee. Like, if you vote out a director, they're not entitled to severance, right? They're there as long as the shareholders, they're there as long as the shareholders continue to elect them. For tax purposes, in terms of the payment, it may be treated as employment income, but they're not employees of the company.
So they may not have employment agreements. I would assume they wouldn't. But like when they receive income, the company would have to withhold that source, do all the things that they would normally do for employees. The CPP and EI is they're a little bit different. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't, and it's quite fact specific. But generally, that is the principle. Okay, so compensation incentives. Well, the company has to pay both its consultants and its employees. If the company's a startup, then generally there might not be a lot of cash floating around to pay the employees, and there will be alternative forms of payment, namely shares and options to purchase shares or other securities. So shares tend to be they're reverse vesting, so they're issued, and then if certain events don't happen, then they get clawed back. Options tend to be vesting, so they won't be issued until like a certain time has gone by or certain events have occurred. And so that could be dependent on, I guess, time or like how well the company's doing, how well the employee or consultant has performed in that particular duty that they're responsible for, and so on. So lots of tax considerations here. Depending on the payment structure, the amount of tax owing by the employee, the amount of deductions at source, those will differ. And so I would assume generally that the startup is a Canadian controlled private corporation, which is a specific term under the Income Tax Act. I'll explain what it means later. But it has like specific, like the payments made by it have like some benefits. So if it's cash salary, then basically everything has to be withheld at source with respect to cash salary, and the employee would have to include that in income like normal. Dividends, well, dividends can be paid to some employees as well because they're also shareholders. For example, they will have exercise options, meaning that they have shares, and so dividends can be paid from. So dividends are counted a little bit differently than normal salary. There won't be deductions at source, but there's a complicated mechanism from what the amount of tax owing on the dividend is. So stock options could also be paid or shares, and then there are also certain deferred salary plans. The deferred salary plans are pretty exotic, and those may not be like something that like at the outset you want to explore, but like later they may become relevant. But generally speaking, if work is done in a certain period of time and payment in respect of that work is made later or earlier, it's still included in income for that period of time. So it's hard to achieve like a good tax outcome by simply just staggering payments, or because the Act generally works on what's known as an accrual basis. Anyways, that said, there are certain deferred salary plans that do that if you stick to certain plans, like stick to the rules. Mostly I'm going to discuss stock options because stock option treatment for CCPCs for employees is particularly advantageous. You can issue stock options to either founders or employees or consultants, but I'll discuss that later. The idea is that like after somebody has the option, if they exercise the option, they have some skin in the game. they care where the company is going, because if the value of the company goes up, then the value of the option that they have will go up. And so the idea is that they have an incentive to work with the company to ensure that it prospers. So when an employee of a CCPC receives an option, nothing, like the employee is not taxed. So that's unusual, because the way that the act works is that when an employee receives anything, it could be a stapler, it could be a car, it could be a right pool car, it could be cash, it could be for payment, deferred payment in cash, so on. All of that is included in income. Like, it's very wide. It's like basically anything paid by the employer or given by the employer to the employee or somebody related to the employee, all of that things included in income. The exception being stock options. So a stock option given to an employee is not going to be to the employee that year.
Can you add contractors to that list, or are they separate?
I'll talk about contractors
Okay,
later.
so they don't
are
apply to this?
separate. Yeah. Yeah, the reason being that the contractors are employees, and so they're not subject to that same very, very broad income included firms. Because stock options are exempted from that particular agreement, they're just very advantageous. That's one reason anyways. So like I said, there's no tax on the grant of the option. And the only thing is that for CCPCs, you just need to make sure that there is some sort of agreement to issue the option. It generally should be a written agreement, and you could have stock option plans and all this stuff that kind of bear on what the stock option is, what rights it carries, and so on. That may not necessarily be needed. I mean, it's definitely recommended, but you do need an agreement that says that you've issued an option and what it means to the employee. And so once you have that, then you get into this treatment where it will not be taxed on receipt. And because it's a CCPC, it also won't be taxed on exercise. So this means that an option generally, most of you probably know, but an option works in the sense that there's going to be an exercise price, and if someone pays that exercise price, which could well be nil, by the way, the exercise price it doesn't have to be positive. Once that's paid, then the company issues the share because of the option. And so at that point, that's what we call the exercise. And so normally, the employee will have received the option, which is something that would normally be taxed, but that won't be. And then when the exercise, the employee will have received a share, ordinarily that would be taxed. But it won't be if the employee also holds the share for 2 years. Yeah.
What if the employee leaves after a year, but he still owns those shares?
I think that depends on what the employment agreement says or what the stock option terms are. So maybe that option has to be repurchased or terminated, or there could be a number of things that happen.
Okay.
Can you get a little more layman on options? I understand the concept of a share, the concept of an option and share. Is that piece is 100% transparent to me?
Well, an option is quite general. You could have an option in respect of anything. So basically, it's like a right to purchase something. It could be a right to sell something as well, but in this context, it's a right to purchase a share. And the share will be issued by the company. Generally, that company is the employer of the employee that's receiving the option. So, does that?
The entire value of the option is that there's a set price for exercise, right? If you start your company and shares are worth 10 cents, and you give somebody an option for 10 cents, you go out, you realize on your business plan. You realize on your business plan and you sell the company for $10 a share, there's 99 right?
Yeah.
That's the whole thing.
Yep.
I'm busy explaining the second part, where you can, where they hold the shares for 2 years, that is taxed.
Okay, so a company issues an option to an employee. The employee chooses to exercise it maybe immediately. So at that point, the company will issue a share to the employee. And so ordinarily, like I said before, anything that's given to an employee is taxed. But in this particular case, if that employee holds a share for 2 years, then there won't be any tax on that receipt of the share.
Like holding it, you mean not selling?
Not selling it, yeah, like that doesn't give it to anyone else. Like, yeah.
But if the company sells, exits for whatever reason, that employee has to exit.
Yeah, so, that's still okay. The entire purpose of like this particular, stock option agreement is that, you're trying to, like, the act is trying to carve out, from like the employment income taxation, like this whole stock option stuff. And so the reason why they're doing that is because they want to give like, in the end, like capital gain treatment to, stock options and the shares that go along with them. And so capital gains, as opposed to like regular employment income, it's like half taxed. So if you have a capital gain of like 100,000 versus employment income of 100,000, then the capital gain only results in $50,000 of income that's taxed. And so it's quite advantageous from that perspective. Yeah.
So if, let's just say if a company hits tanks, its value of the shares tanks, and the employee shares also tanks. So let's just say an employee has capital, what's stopping him from purchasing all the shares from the employees that's working in the company? Is there anything that's stopping them?
So you're saying that if the fair market value of the company plummets and then the employees want, or whoever's holding the shares want to sell them? I don't see why.
More like someone who wants to buy all of them.
So you have an example where you have an employee, so you do, and then we all are also employees. We happen to have exercised options in the past, so we have shares. The price goes down, you want to buy our shares. So the answer is going to be found in a couple of areas. Number one, typically companies would have restrictions on transfer that require board approval. Number two, as part of your exercise, it would be prudent to have you sign on to whatever the shareholders agreement is that the company has. And one of the rights, at least that we would recommend that you have, would be rights in favor of other shareholders or investors, depending on where the company's at, that if one of us wants to sell you these shares at a really good deal, we have to give that deal to everybody else to on a pro rata basis. So that thwarts the attempt to secretly scoop up a bunch of shares behind the scenes.
Yeah. Your question though does raise like a tax problem.
Yeah.
So I think like what you're referring to is like it's a tax trap. So the employees will have exercised their options at like a high price, say $10 or something per share, and then sold at $1 later. The way that the Income Tax Act works is that at the time that they exercise the option, there was a benefit of say like $9 or something per option per share, and that is eventually going to be included in income. And you can't get out of that, even though you take a loss later. So that amount divided by 2 will be still in income. So that can bring about a situation where the employee ends up paying almost as much tax as they gain in terms of the sale of the shares, or even possibly even more. Yeah.
During the dot-com implosion, a lot of employees had exercised their stock options.
Yeah.
And before they cashed them, they plummeted to almost zero.
Yeah.
And then they were left with huge tax obligations, but no liquidity, cash to pay them.
Yeah. So that
Any employee who exercises an option should sell some of the shares if they can, so they can meet a future tax obligation.
yeah, there is a 2-year hold period that is advantageous for a number of reasons. I guess I'll say a bit of it here, but so if you do hold the share for 2 years, then the capital gains treatment, all of the income is kind of deferred until the time the share is sold. And so the benefit on receiving the option, the benefit on exercising the option, all of that is deferred until the share is sold. And so that's generally good. You want to defer income tax to the possible time value of money and all that. the thing is that if you do hold private company shares, like CCPC shares for 2 years, then there's like a lifetime capital gains that kicks in. But if you sell it before you hold it for 2 years, then that exemption is not there. And so there's an incentive that employees at least hold for that period. And the reason being, again, goes back to the fact that the government is trying to incentivize employees to be on the same page with the company and to have the same goals.
Do we have time for another question? I have just one from online.
Oh.
If not, it's okay. Okay, could you just explain a bit more about the deferred salary plan? Like, how does it work?
There are a lot of deferred salary plans.
Okay.
Generally, they're only. Yeah, I think I would.
I went through it. We've got a lot of material to go through.
Yeah.
I know all of us are prepared to stay for questions at the end, so why don't we'll get through a few more slides. We deal with some one-offs, but with all the specific questions, we can deal with them at the end, and that way we can make sure we get through the rest of the materials.
Okay. So if it's not a CCPC, then there's additional results. Well, let's suppose right now that the company that the employer is public corporation or it's controlled by a foreign party, then it's no longer going to be a CCPC. So the idea here is that basically it's the same income tax treatment as like if the option was issued under the CCPC plan, but like the problem, well, at the time that the option is exercised, there will be an income tax inclusion. And so it's not at the time that the share is sold, but it's at the time that the exercise of the option happens. And so that's one thing. And the amount of the income inclusion will be generally 1/2 of the benefit from the exercise of the option, as long as the option, like, basically the attributes of the option was such that at the time that it was issued for a strike price that was greater than the market value of the shares of the company, then it'll get this treatment generally. But otherwise it may not, and then the whole thing is included in income, you don't get a deduction, it doesn't look like capital gains anymore. And then at the time that the shares, well, once you have the share, it doesn't matter. So you have a share, it's like any other share, you can sell it when you want, it doesn't matter, because there's no longer a 2-year, there's no incentive for you to hold it for 2 years, you can sell it for any day, because you've already had your inclusion. The thing to remember is that if at exercise, the non-CCPC has issued the option with a strike price that's below the market value of the shares, then the treatment is not there. And that's the main thing to watch out for. Where a non-employee, so basically a consultant, receives a stock option, then that's considered revenue for them. So basically, they're receiving something, they're receiving property for services rendered. That property has some worth. Like the option may not be exercisable at the time, it generally shouldn't be, but there's a possibility that during the lifetime of the option, it could be exercised, and so therefore it has a value, like it has some sort of expected value, and the consultant, it would be in its best interest to probably include a little bit in value for that reason. There is an argument that if the consultant does like fairly value the option when received, so that year it includes income, then when the option is exercised and it becomes a share, then that exercise shouldn't be a tax event. So that could be quite lucrative, because that means that if there was an option that was issued for $1 and was exercisable at let's say $9, so just thinking of an example on the fly. Let's say it's exercisable at $10. The consultant can then include a certain amount of like when it receives the option. I'm not quite sure how you would price it, but there are like option pricing methods like Black-Scholes, other like even more esoteric and complicated ways of pricing the option. Somebody could pay, like you could pay someone to do it. And so once that's included in income, then at the time that it's exercised, the consultant will have received like a $9 benefit because it was a $1 option, now it's a $10 share. But there will be no tax owing at that point. But not all consultants can do that. So generally the ones that might be able to do that are the ones that hold the option or the share as what's called capital property, as opposed to the ones that would hold it as inventory. And that's like a really general concept for income tax. But the capital property is basically like an investment property. It's like something that you use to earn further income, and shares are that because they're used to earn dividends. So if that's the case, then you can get very good treatment for consultants holding being issued options. Otherwise, be careful. So I wanted to say a bit about employees and consultants that are not resident, because I know in the tech space there's like a very free flow of ideas, and it could be that your employee or your consultant is located anywhere in the world without too much difficulty. Generally speaking, employing somebody who's not in Canada when they're working is a bad idea. The reason being is that wherever they are, say they're in the United States, the United States could say that by employing this person, you've got a permanent establishment in the United States. Like, I'm not a US tax lawyer, but I can tell you that the reverse, if there's a US company that's employing a Canadian, the Canadian side can say that. So the US could say, well, you have a permanent establishment in the US by virtue of having this employee in the US. You are using this employee to earn income, so therefore you need to, at the very least, justify the amount of income that you've earned in the US as a result of your permanent establishment in the US. Even if, like, in the end, the exercise results in no tax being paid in the US, the company still has to go through the rigmarole of like complying with the US tax laws, which if you're a Canadian company, you may not be set up to comply with the US tax laws. It could be quite expensive, and there are ways around this. The way being, only have consultants. So if you have, or anyone else in the world, look to have a consultant agreement rather than an employment agreement. Generally speaking, if there are employees or consultants that are not resident in Canada for tax purposes, but they come to Canada, they work for a bit and then they leave again, then the company has withholding of obligations in respect of any fees or any employment income earned by that consultant or employee. And so if it's a consultant, there's a 15% withholding. At any time that a Canadian company pays a consultant for work done in Canada, non-Canadian consultant for work done in Canada. And if it's an employee, and then the employee comes up to Canada to do some work, then there's full withholding. So just like you would for like a normal employee that's Canadian. So these are like things to really watch out for. But there are waivers that you can apply for. The waiver program is quite complicated, and generally it's limited.
So just to wrap up the different buckets of individuals involved in an enterprise, there's also what's called advisors, and many of you might already have advisors. And if you do, you may have such advisory panel. Advisors are non-director, typically subject matter experts in your field. They advise the board. The time commitment is much less, 5 to 10 hours a year, and their only compensation is option-based. And so we see that quite commonly, even for very young companies.
Okay, just going to say a couple of things on this slide. Conflicts of interest. If you're subject to duties, there are things you need to be aware of. If you're a director, you've got fiduciary duties to act in the best interest of the company, and with a degree of care, a reasonable degree of care. If you're an employee or an officer, you have duties to the corporation. If you're in a situation of conflict of interest, where you have conflicting interests, disclose them. if you're like on the board, you disclose it, don't vote. If you're in a CEO position, disclose it, and sort of make it known. We see issues all the time around people that didn't disclose, that they had a conflict of interest and decisions were made. So just key is if you've got duties to the company, make sure you disclose it so that the conflict can be appropriately addressed. Just a couple things on this. In terms of where to set up your company, like there's absolutely nothing wrong with VC companies, right? It's great corporate law. There's no residency requirements. We have a lot of big companies around the world that choose BC law. You can see some, Rogers, and they're sort of more of an Ontario company. They use BC law. Golden Core BC law. It's flexible structure. There's no residency requirements. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. If you're a Canadian company, you get the CCPC status, so you get preferable tax status for stock options. You're eligible for, I think John's going to talk about it, income tax credits through the venture capital program. People invest $1, they get 25 cents back or something like that immediately on their tax return. So if you're going to incorporate, in Delaware or the Bahamas, or whatever it may be, there's got to be really good reasons, because if you've got people in BC working for you, they're giving up a lot. And if you're seeking capital from BC investors, they're giving up a lot by the fact that you're not a BC company that can take advantage of the local regime. In terms of setting up the corporate structure, I've had one client come to me that had up to Class J preferred shares, all of which were issued to like a variety of people. There's no way to really do that. The simpler you keep it, the better. If an investor's coming in and they have to assess this weird capital structure, it just doesn't work as well. The really good companies that we see, way more often than not, it's a simple class of common shares. They've got, their employees have options into it. And then when your VC comes along, they may request a preference share and, you deal with it at that time. But, don't overcomplicate things. It's not, not normally worth it. If you're trying to grow your company, if this is like your own personal company and, you're never going to bring in investors and you're never going to bring in other shareholders, do whatever your tax advisor says. But if you actually want to grow it and bring in investment and have something that employees are going to participate in, keep it simple. We've got in here, avoid issuing secured debt. Like anybody that wants to do secured debt wants to be in first place. So meaning like this primary secured creditor getting paid out first. So once you've given that up to somebody, everybody else is in second place after that. So just think about when you're going to do it. If you're going to issue secured debt, grant security, think long and hard. And yeah, I think those are the main things on that slide. I'll pass it back.
So can I ask a quick question on that question of equity or debt?
Yeah.
So my co-founder and I have been bootstrapping so far, and we've actually invested a fair bit of cash into the company, in addition to obviously the in-kind time, since neither of us are drawing salary. And we're curious about how best to reflect that on the balance sheet. Do we show it as a loan to the company? Do we show it as equity investment into the company? Understanding there's a bunch of, what would the pros and cons be of different approaches?
It just, we can maybe get more detail after, but the typical thing I would think is an investor that is going to come in with equity doesn't want you to be in debt while they're in equity, because you get paid. Debt is primary, right? Like debt gets paid out before equity. So if I'm an investor and, I want you to be in equity, and then I'll come in and be in, I'll be in debt or I'll be in preferred equity, so I sit above you in the cap structure. So we could probably deal with more specifics, but that would be the first thing I would say on that.
So the structuring of the financing, like again, tax, bears pretty heavily on that. There are a lot of choices to be made. So for example, like do you equity or debt? Well, there are considerations, well, that Steve just talked about, but there are also tax considerations in the sense that, well, you have CCPC status, that matters. Well, CCPC status depends on who has control of the company. and it depends on who else.
Kennedy is connected to the microphone.
Can you hear me now?
No.
Thank you. So as I was saying, there's a lot of choices to be made in terms of financing. If it's equity or debt, well, if the company is trying to preserve CCPC status, then it will not want to be controlled by a non-Canadian entity, and it won't want to be controlled by a public entity either. And so it can't issue shares to these entities. So that basically means that, well, debt has to be issued. That's also problematic because, well, if too much debt is issued to a non-Canadian entity, then there are rules that can kick in. Not all non-Canadian entities, but just certain ones you have to be careful of. And that just has to be kept in mind when equity or debt is to be issued in financing. So, like, the other issue to consider is whether shares, if it's equity that's being issued, whether shares are going to be issued from Treasury. Are they going to be sold? Is a new class of shares going to be set up in order to do this? Is paid up capital important? Like, these things have to kind of be looked at before the decision is made as to like how to do the financing. Generally, it's best to start with a simple setup and then to make it more complicated as the need arises. Okay, so I've thrown around the term CCPC a lot. I'm just going to go into it a little bit. So again, it means a company that doesn't have more than 50% of its shares owned by either a non-Canadian or a public company. So like if you group all of the shares owned by those bad shareholders together and it ends up being more than 50% of the voting shares, then that means that the company is not a CCPC. Or if it turns out that for whatever reason, control is held by somebody who's a non-resident or by a company that is not a CCPC. Why does that matter? Well, there are a lot of really good tax advantages to being a CCPC. One is the so-called small business deduction. So on the what that means is that on the first 500,000 of income of the corporation, it gets a deferred tax rate of 11% this year in BC. 11% is really low compared to the general corporate tax rate, which is 27%. So that's a 16% savings. So 16 times 500,000, that's like about $80,000 worth of savings in tax. Quite big. There's the capital gains exemption, which I mentioned earlier. So this is an exemption available to shareholders of CCPC only. And so, like I said before, if these shareholders have held their shares for 2 years and they sell them to another party for value, then up to about $850,000 of that capital gain that's realized is tax-free. That's quite big. And so a lot of the times, business founders will try to work into that exemption and structure their exit in such a way that they get the full amount of the exemption, or they spread it to their family and so on. That's been made more difficult recently, but there's a lot of structuring around this capital gains exemption just because the amount of exempt income is quite high, and it's only available for CCPCs. And so CCPCs also get a deferred shred credit rate, and so they get more credits back. It's 35% versus 20% for non-CCPCs. And then the big thing is that their shred credits are refundable. So you had if they had no income, then the government will still repay the amount of credit that they earn. Whereas otherwise, they would have to have income so that the government will only offset the tax that they would owe on that income. And so that's a big benefit. And so, but the other one we already talked about, which is that they get this preferred stock option deferral deduction scheme that works only for CCPCs.
Does the firm consult on shred as well? provide advice to?
Well, we provide advice on like the provisions for SHRED, but we don't do like SHRED plans.
Sure.
Like, like the detailed plans to ensure that the program goes through the SHRED. Although we can definitely recommend it. And so all of these different considerations, depending on whether you need them or not, they'll restrict who you issue shares to and who you issue debt to, and to what extent you do. I should note that there is a VCC exception for the shareholders of CCTC. So to the extent that a VCC holds shares and the VCC is controlled by a public company, or the VCC is public, then that will be counted towards that 50%, which may be useful for startups.
Great, thanks. So we're gonna dive into to shares and some other corporate issues. But I guess just as an aside, there's a lot of content here, especially on the tax side. And again, everything is couched within, well, what's practical and what's in the best interest of the company, right? Like to caveat to a story that's heard this week. One of the clients I have is a device company that's now located in the US. And what had happened is they started here in Vancouver, and as they were growing their funding sources, the VCs that wanted to invest in them were all US or international. And the opportunities to get really talented people in their space were all East Coast US. So did they lose their CCPC status? Oh yeah. They're now 90% owned by non-Canadians, but who cares, right? That's where the opportunity was, and you just deal with it, right? So all of this is in the context of what's in the best interest of the company. Just, a lot of this is issue spotting so that you are aware of how complex these areas are, and therefore you know that you should go get advice on a fact-specific basis when you encounter these issues, right? So we'll talk about founder shares. So founder shares is something that's talked about like colloquially at discussions like ours and amongst founders, and there's some misconceptions about what that is. Simply put, founder shares are just the first common shares that are issued in the company, and the reason why they're issued at a nominal price is because the company's not worth anything more than your idea. At least if you're starting it at the same time that you're kind of putting your idea together. There's tons of exceptions to that. Where you run into problems that we see is there's an understanding that somehow the founder shares take on a different nature than other common shares. And what you have a lot of times is founders, the three founders had started a company, and let's say they each owned a third of the company, and they received 3 million shares each. Or let's use the example, they received 30 shares each, and they said, we're all going to be equal. And then they go down the path and they meet some, and things are kind of going okay, and they meet a fourth person. They say, wow, this person should be one of our founders. Let's each give them 10 shares. Well, if the company has grown in value, you can't just give them the shares. Well, I thought my founder shares were founder shares and they're only worth a cent. That's not how it works, right? So founder shares are very simple, but it's critical to get it right at the outset, because the transfer of founder shares or your ability to bring in other people as quote founders in the future, depending on what the company's done, is quite limited. And that's why it's so important to get that right at the outset. So who are these initial common shares issued to? Founders and senior officers, not employees, not outside investors. Like in my example, each of the three founders got 30 shares each. Well, if you go out for funding and you say, we think we're now worth $1 million, and we'd like to offer you the ability to purchase, 6 shares or something, or 10 shares. The investor's gonna go, well, that doesn't sound very exciting, because this other investment I have 1 million shares. It's optics, right? But it doesn't make any sense, because then what's gonna happen? You're gonna bring in an employee and you're gonna give them an option for 1 share. Right? Well, that doesn't sound very exciting either. So we want to establish a company that's built for success. So we usually recommend 4 to 8 million founder shares. So that's a good basis upon which you can grow, whether it's outside investment or the issuance of stock options. And the vesting of founder shares is very critical. Now we've heard about the vesting of options. Vesting of founder shares, which are already issued, is what's often called a vesting. It says 3 or 4 of us, we all agree that we're going to dedicate our lives to this. It turns out one of us just wants to go to travel for the rest of their lives, starting in 6 months. It's not fair that that person got the same amount of shares that we all got. We're all here working 7 days a week. And so reverse vesting agreements give us the right to claw back those shares if the future doesn't turn out the way our crystal ball said it would.
Can you just clarify, so in your third example, you say sort of 15-20%. Are you, 15-25%, are you proposing you give out 75% of the shares and leave a bucket for future founders? Not considering future additions to the management team, 15-25%. So are you proposing that instead of allocating all the shares initially, that you leave a bucket set aside for future ads?
Yeah, well, I think probably what the reference is, to answer your question, is you're going to need, like we all talked about, options. So, you might have 3 or 4 of you might, get the product through to a certain stage, and then you realize we really need this type of executive to run the company. And that person says, well, I'm not willing to leave my job at Amazon and come over here unless I own X%. And again, to use my example, you say, well, we can't just give you free shares. We can give you options and do a couple of other things. And so when you're having it in your head, okay, well, we 3 or 4 founders each own a third or a fourth, having in your head, well, we're going to need to dilute ourselves to take on talent to grow the company. That's really what that is.
So let me reframe the question. So are you planning for that in advance?
No,
So
again, and it goes back to my example, I can't give you these founder shares that somehow are classified in a different way. There is no founder shares. These are just common shares that are issued at the beginning of the company, right? So there's no bucket, there's no extra shares that you can pull out of the drawer.
Simply diluting yourself.
You're simply diluting yourself, and you're doing it within the framework. You can do it at the time based on the value and the tax implications at the time.
Yeah, so just to chime in a bit. So when the shares are given, that's considered the disposition of fair value. So somebody's gonna possibly bear a bunch of tax. So even though like the shares are issued at like a cent, they're worth $100 or something, there's gonna be capital gain.
That's a good question. So let's start to talk about financing, because that's probably top of mind for many of you, and determining a roadmap for financing. When we're thinking about financing, what I mean by that is how much money are we going to raise, why are we raising that money, and where does that money get us, right? That's functionally your roadmap. All incredibly critical points when you're talking to an investor, and many of you have already been in pitch situations where you've been drilled on all of those points. And so that's why it's so important not only to have a very clear and complete corporate structure and a set of documentation, but also a thought process that's built out to stress test the assumptions that you're making. You say, we're going to raise $1 million and we're worth $5 million. Why? What is $1 million going to do? Well, we think it's going to do this. Well, when are you going to need to raise money again? What does that look like, right? These are all questions that many of you probably already consider. Now, there's many sources of financing, and the great thing is the resources that are available with respect to non-dilutive financing are really user-friendly. And so I would encourage you to, if you don't already know, access all the information that's available on the web about that. Non-equity financing, so things like IRAP, SHRED, other grants, quasi-governmental organizations like BDC. But I would say out of this list, IRAP and SHRED are the 2 that we see most commonly. And IRAP, in order to be IRAP funded, functionally you're a smaller, medium-sized business, profit-oriented, 500 or fewer employees, that likely qualifies all of you. And there's a number of other criteria, but what we see for very early stage companies, the value is the coverage on hiring people and the large percentage of their salaries that are covered by some of these grants. So that's often what we see. So equity as a source of financing, which we've touched on repeatedly through the discussion. So again, initial equity can come from founders, bootstrapping. This gentleman over here can come from your friends and family, the people that have the most rubbery arms that can write you the $10,000, $20,000 checks to get you going. But it can also come from some of the more traditional sources like angel investors, and there's a great angel network in the Lower Mainland that funds startups, VCs, investment banks, underwriters. I would say that for this and going public transactions, for this discussion, the most important would be friends and family, angels, and VC investors. So these are incredibly general ranges of investment. To give you some sort of a sense of some of the check sizes that we see. Obviously, VCs, the check sizes in later stages can be much larger. Had a VC write a $65 million check yesterday morning to one of our clients, so US. So the range is gigantic, and obviously some of the larger ones make the newspaper and well aware of them. One of the VC-specific programs that many of you are probably familiar with is the venture capital programs for the refundable tax credits. So there's really two structures that you can get this 30% refundable credit. One is by having a direct investment made in your company if you're the founder of an eligible business corporation. The other is that you could have a VCC, a venture capital corporation, make an investment in your company, and that venture capital corporation receives investment from investors, and it's at that VCC stage that they get a tax credit. A business corporation is you're a company that qualifies for a fairly new set of criteria for a technology company in the province. So you have to be a VC or a federal company. You have to be engaged in manufacturing and processing. You have to be engaged or destination research, development, proprietary technology. That's the one most of our clients fall within. Development of interactive digital and media products, community diversification outside of the mainland, or clean tech. Those are kind of the big heads. Under 100 employees, 75% of wages paid in BC, 80% assets in BC. Initial 25,000 investment. So before you become an EBC, the investment capital branch needs to see that somebody, including you as a founder, has given 25,000. So, to build off of your question, what might happen is you might have shareholder loans sitting there for the amount you bootstrap, and it comes time for local angel investors to invest in your company, and you say, oh, I realize I need 25,000, so then you take a portion of that, you convert it into shares, the investment capital branch says that's fine to qualify for that first 25. That would be one example we see over and over where a bootstrap company brings themselves into eligibility to get that first $25,000 investment. Or if you have non-VC investors that don't care, use that as the first 25,000. Just 2 weeks ago, or anyways, in the last month, the NDP government expanded some of the allocations for this program. So instead of a $5 million cap, there's a $10 million cap on a company that can raise tax credit eligible investments. Individual investors now have a larger allocation. So I believe it was $60,000 of tax credits each year that an angel could get, and now it's doubled. There's a bunch of other criteria. They've put in writing that some convertible instruments will qualify. Before, there was a large amount of almost infighting between government and the professional services that serve startups and tech companies about what was eligible, convertible debt, debt's not eligible, safes. So they've started to clarify some of that. So I would encourage you to talk to your lawyers if that's relevant. But this is a program that is the tail that wags the dog in so many angel deals. And so being informed about this program, I think, will do you a great service in the future. The next slide we have is a break. I'm not sure whether we want to break.
I think we're around 20, 25 minutes behind schedule. So I think if you guys are okay, we'll go through the break. My next section is on securities legislation, and I'll hit all the points, but I'll make it kind of high level. And I think going through that relatively quickly should get us back on track for ending up on time and still going through the presentation. Securities legislation I'm going to talk about, and the high level piece is every time you issue a security, an option, equity, a debt security, you're dealing with the Securities Act, okay? And you're engaging, potentially engaging the teeth of the BC Securities Commission. So there's a couple of high-level principles and a couple of reserved exemptions that I'll talk through. So rule number one, as I said, anytime you issue a security, you're in the statute. You're either doing it under a prospectus If you're doing it under prospectus, that's like you're going public transaction. So most people in here and, most companies we deal with are doing it under a prospectus. So they're using what's called a prospectus exemption. And these are the prospectus exemptions, the things that people sort of talk about in the, really all private company financings, we're all just working in the world of prospectus exemptions. And on this slide, I've set out what the typical ones people talk about are, and then I'll spend just a couple minutes or a little bit of time just going through the details of each particular one, so you get a bit of context for them. So the first one, family, friends, business associates. The prospectus of the Securities Commission is that this is a very narrow exemption. It's not a very broad exemption. This isn't your Facebook friends or people you're linked to on Instagram or whatever they may be. These are people that know where the bathroom is in your house. That's kind of the degree of connection the Securities Commission is expecting. Family, family is a pretty obvious one. This is, there's in the test, brother, sister, mom, dad, grandparent, that sort of thing. There's direct connections. The business associates and friends are very specific that they want you to be able to establish a connection. It's tied into how long have they known you, and is it a sufficient amount of time to know you and be exposed to you so they can assess your your trustworthiness and your competence is basically what they're thinking. If you issue stock to somebody and things don't go well and they go to the Securities Commission, the Securities Commission and you relied on this exemption, they're going to say, what was your basis? So whenever people issue securities on this exemption, or any exemption really, but particularly this one, you're including a certificate from the person or from, that says, I know this person, I've known them this long, I know this, I know that, I worked with them in this space, I was involved with them in the startup. And that's your, that's establishing the record so that when the Securities Commission comes knocking after the fact, which they do a bunch, you're able to say, look, we were duly diligent. So narrow exemption and you're documenting it. So I think, and no limits on what you can raise, and it's, it's meant to be somebody you truly know, sufficient time, assess your capabilities and trustworthiness. Do not use this one as a way to bring in money from a bunch of different people you're loosely connected to. It's just a recipe for disaster if things don't go well. Accredited investor, this is, there are very specific tests for this one. This is, it's, the context in which most people use it is people that either have, 5 million in net assets, 1 million in financial assets, or income of over $200,000 a year, or income combined with their spouse over $300,000 a year. If you have people in your network like this, they can subscribe for securities. There's no limit on what they can subscribe for. And again, when you take the money, you have them fill out an accredited investor certificate. They certify to you, this is the basis on which I'm an accredited investor. You keep that in your file, and and that's in your record when you, if you're called upon to sort of establish the basis under which you issue the securities. And I think that's what I just talked about. So private issuer exemption, talk about it here. So this, again, to be a private issuer, there's a couple of key components. They're on the next slide. I'll just go forward for a second. So it's you haven't filed a prospectus. You have less than 50 security holders. You've got restrictions to transfer in your articles, and you only issue securities to directors, officers, employees, close personal friends and family, and accredited investors, basically. So if you issue under an OM, you're no longer a private issuer. If you issue under a crowdfunding exemption, you're no longer a private issuer. If you issue to consultants, you're no longer a private issuer. So anyway, you want to be a private issuer as long as you can. Once you lose your private issuer status by going over 50, you can't get it back by going back under 50. And once you're over 50, as I mentioned, you're filing reports with the Securities Commission. And in my experience, it's normally at that point where you kind of get on their radar and they'll do a compliance review and say, can you show us the subscription agreements for every person you've ever issued securities and the basis on which you established that you had an exemption? So, you know, anyway, it's not particularly fun. So, you know, it's better to stay under 50, you know, unless there's real commercial reasons for going over 50. Yeah.
There's a difference between issuing options than actual shares, right? It doesn't matter how many options holders you have, as long as.
No, well, it's 50 security holders, so.
So it's an option. Somebody holding options.
Yeah,
holds-
you should count them, yeah. So I think I've touched on this. So if you lose your private issuer status, you're not public, you now have to file your trading reports with the Securities Commission, yeah? Sorry, I can't hear you. Yeah, that's not an exemption within the private issuer. Unless they're also a director, officer, employee. You may be able to argue that they were a close business associate and they should fall within that, but you know, otherwise they would not be within the private issuer exemption. 150,000 exemption. This is not within the private issuer exemption. So if you use this one, you're no longer a private issuer. So you know, we typically see public companies using this more. This is, you know, if you're investing $150,000 and you're not an individual, but it's a company investing $150,000, the Securities Commission will take that as sort of prima facie evidence that you're sophisticated. That qualifies as an exemption. Crowdfunding exemption. We have one of these. I'm not a big fan of it. I'll just talk for a minute because I know these things are kind of new and people like the sound of it. You can raise, you know, 250 grand twice a year. So it's, you know, in the scheme of financing, it's not the biggest. You can only get $100 or $1,500 per person. And the real, you know, the real reason I don't like it is you're going to end up with like, you know, hundreds of shareholders, right? Like this is a pain, you know, instead of having to answer to a dozen people or whatever, there's going to be a ton of people out there that, you know, you're going to have to deal with, that you're going to show up to your AGM, that may complain to the Securities Commission if they don't, you know, if they think their, you know, the investment didn't turn out the way they wanted. And just to be, you know, sort of a general pain in the ass. So it is there. It is an option. I don't see why, unless, you know, this is your only option for raising the money, I don't see why you go through the aggravation if you can, you know, use some of the other available exemptions. OM exemption, you know, better than the crowdfunding exemption. The thing with this, so you put together sort of, it's not a prospectus, but it's, you know, a sort of small offering document. You do need to have audited statements to use the exemption, so that's, you know, a thing that you have to deal with. And that allows you to go and issue securities to residents, and, you know, I think actually now all the provinces in Canada, and without having to, they don't have to be accredited, they don't have to be friends and family, they don't have to be, you know, any of the other things. But if you use this one, you're no longer a private issuer as well. Employee risk acknowledgement. So using the OM exemption, you have to, there's another paper that you have to collect from them where they acknowledge the risk and they have a right of action for rescission or damages for a misrep in the OM. Employee, director, officers, consultants, you can always issue stock to these people. Consultant isn't part of the private issuer exemption, so there's, you know, you move out of it if you do that. The consultant definition, you know, employee, director, officer, those all have legal sort of meanings. Consultant is kind of loose in the sense that like lots of people call themselves consultant. To rely on the exemption, you have to have a written agreement with the person and they have to provide bona fide services. So it's just, you know, in a sense, an employee, you don't have to because everybody knows what that is. Consultant, there's a little bit more formality that needs to go to ensure you have the exemption.
All right, so I guess we know who we can issue shares to, so let's talk a little bit about, you know, doing your financing and raising money, what agreements are associated with that. Doing a financing can take on a huge number of structures, so this is a very basic introduction to that. non-disclosure agreement, so it may be the case that you require potential investors to sign an NDA before you're willing to really talk to them about your company, your idea, your secret sauce. More sophisticated angel investors and VCs are sometimes hesitant to sign NDAs, anything with really onerous obligations because of the velocity that they have of going through different opportunities and not wanting to be constantly thinking about, which NDA with which company when they can barely remember how many meetings they had with different companies in your space. But an NDA is always going to be a good thing to make sure that, when you're going outside of public information about your company, that you're protected. Term sheet and then a subscription agreement or, whatever document evidences the investment, whether it's, a debenture, a promissory note, a safe, meaning simple agreement for future equity, which is becoming more prevalent here. So we talked about NDAs, it can be 2 ways or 1 way. Term sheets, so this is really one of the critical documents to have done right before you do financing. So as many of you probably know, a term sheet is a summary of what exactly your financing entails. So think of the type of security that you're offering. Is it a share? What kind of share? Is it a unit? So is it a bundle of a share plus something else? Perhaps, it's a share for $1, but then it's a warrant to buy a share for another $1 for a couple of years. Convertible debt, safe, or something else. Valuation. Valuation is going to be one of the most sensitive conversations that you have, both internally and with your investors. What is your pre-money valuation? Meaning what is currently the value of your company now? It's going to be extremely hard, and I sympathize a lot with our clients, certainly in the early stages, when they say, well, I want to go raise $500,000 from angel investors, and I want to issue common shares. Well, that's simple enough. So what's the price? Well, we need to figure out the pre-money valuation. Well, I don't know what I'm worth. Well, let's start figuring that out. People will look at their competitors. People will look at, well, typically companies like us raise money at $3 million, so maybe that's us. A little bit of it's going to be art, a little bit of it's going to be science, a little bit of it's going to be going out and seeing what number gets traction in the marketplace, right? Maybe we come out at $3 million. Is it non-diluted, partially diluted, fully diluted? What I mean there is, okay, what is the calculation to arrive at on a per share basis? So to go back to our example, maybe we had 9 million shares with our 3 founders, but if we've already done an option plan, because we've started hiring employees and maybe our option pool is 1 million options, and a sophisticated investor might say, I get it that you're a $3 million company, but you have to include all the options in the securities that are used to determine the price per share. And you say, well, we haven't done that yet. And they say, well, I'm making you guys bear the weight of that dilution when I'm arriving at my price per share. And that can be an acrimonious negotiation, but we're seeing constantly, and it's a lot of the themes that we get from the Valley and other major jurisdictions, that investors are going to require at least some of that dilution to be borne by the founders. Use of proceeds, whether it's general working capital, whether it's a specific project, getting something to market, getting, whatever it is, investors are going to want to know what their money's going towards. Going back to our example, investors are going to want to know that, if me and you each have 100 grand sitting there in shareholder loans, that the investors' 200 grand isn't going to go right back into our pockets, right? That's an obvious one. Investors' rights. So we know what kind of security we're getting. We know the price. We know what the money is going to be used for. But what else do we get? Investors, especially savvy ones, are going to expect a minimum amount of kind of contractual rights. They're going to perhaps want pro rata rights to be able to participate in future financings and maintain their stake. They might want rights of first refusal over employees that may seek to sell their shares if there's a time that employees might want to get liquidity. They might want a board seat. They might want that shareholders to even guarantee them that board seat. They may want contractual approval rights that say, you can't do X, Y, and Z without our approval, to make sure that the management team is boxed in within a reasonable parameters about what they can do that might control their investment. So all of those things may be contained in your term sheet. Subscription agreement, so let's say for my example, we're just issuing very simple common shares. The subscription agreement is going to be the document within which we come up with the rights and restrictions surrounding that share issuance. So basic level, it's going to say all of the key financial terms to issuing the shares. There's going to be representations and warranties made about the company. So the company and perhaps the founders themselves will have to make promises about the current state of the company, that they own their intellectual property, that there's no current litigation, that they're generally complying with law. They're going to perhaps wrap what the current cap table looks like, so that they're standing behind the information that they had in their term sheet or their cap table. The investor will also be required, or at least we would recommend that the investor makes a number of representation and warranties and acknowledgements about the fact that this is a small startup company that bears an extreme amount of risk, and as a result of them buying shares under an exemption to securities laws, they don't have all of the robust protection that securities laws may afford them. So we find a way to turn that into 30 pages that makes your head spin, and we slap on a certificate at the back. It was what Steve talked about, with the particular exemption that they're going to fall under. If it's convertible debt, we'll have to put together a convertible debt instrument, whether it's a promissory note, and that will have key terms surrounding that convertible debt. So yes, it will be debt, it may bear interest, there will be a set repayment schedule, but the convertible aspect of it will usually be that upon a future financing of a set size, the debt will convert at a specific rate. It usually won't be the price that the new investors are paying, because we want to reflect that this was riskier capital earlier, so it will likely be a discount to that, and 20% are common discount percentages. And that can be secured by a GSA, and if there's a number of lenders in this debt financing transaction, there can be a lender agreement that generally sets out the rights that the lenders have, and what they can and cannot do as a group or individually. And debt is not eligible for EBC tax credits.
I was just going to say, we're happy to make the presentation available to everybody after. I've seen people taking pictures and whatnot. We should have said it at the beginning, but we'll give it to Angie and she can give it to you guys. So hopefully that takes some of the heat off of them.
So something that's become more common in the last 5 years is what's called a SAFE, and you may have heard this in presentations like this. Simple agreement for future equity is literally what it means. It's an agreement that is not debt, no interest, no maturity date. It's functionally an agreement that turns into shares later. And the reason why that's a good thing sometimes is, okay, let's go back to our founders table, our kitchen table, the three of us are sitting around and we say, well, we don't know what our company's worth. And we don't really feel confident that we're going to arrive at a number to tell our friends and family or our angel investors and have that be accurate. So what we're going to do is we're going to enter into these agreements with them, and it's going to say that these agreements are going to turn into shares at future financing at a discount, again, to reflect that this was riskier capital. And it's going to be at that future financing when we have our angel investors or we have our VCs and they're investing $1 million or $2 million in us, and they've done an extreme amount of due diligence and they're very sophisticated, and they say, okay, your company is worth $5 million, and therefore it's whatever, a buck a share. And this SAFE is going to turn into those shares at 80 cents, the equivalent, right? 20% discount perhaps. And that gets around two things. That gets you the money earlier because you avoid the valuation exercise, and it gets the investors a reasonable return on a future, a reasonable discount to a future financing. And there may also be other mechanisms that are investor friendly in this. There could be a cap on the valuation. So if for some reason you find somebody that's going to value you at $100 million of that next financing, and then your friends and family say, well, hold on a second, I just got one share. Maybe you're capped at a $5 million valuation. And they can become actually quite complex, but the purpose of SAFE traditionally is to get around that huge roadblock that you guys have when you're trying to value your company early. Stock options. So we've gone through stock options quite a bit today, so I'll speed through this. But again, the right to purchase shares at a predetermined price, used to incent team building. Where we see it most often, well, the pain point we see that causes the stock option plan to be implemented is when you've got a little bit of money and you say, I need to stretch out this couple $100 grand as far as I can. Well, you can't pay everybody cash what they're worth. Well, how are we gonna top them up? Well, we're gonna give them stock options, so that we fill in the non-cash portion of their compensation. And again, they get skin in the game, and they become members of the team. These are very general allocations of a pool. This isn't your company, this is the pool. So again, you have, a pool equal to 10% of the issued outstanding shares. Perhaps this is some of the breakdowns of where you may see different buckets of personnel. Investing over 2 to 4 years, 3 to 4 years is very common. There can be a lot of different kinds of vesting schedules. The one that I like quite a bit is 3 to 4 years for the 1 year cliff. 1 year cliff meaning there's 0 vesting up until 1 year. And then on the year, you get the full year of vesting. And the reason I like that is because, that first 6 to 12 months is really a feeling out process, may literally be a probationary period. And, if it doesn't work out on one or both sides, and both sides say goodbye, you don't really want, a tiny number of options vested, but that person may become a tiny shareholder, and then they're a tiny shareholder that's a big pain every year at your AGM, because, maybe you didn't exit on good terms. And so it seems that I like that because it's reflective of, kind of that first stage of an employee company. The next thing we're going to do, just at the end here, is run through a number of slides that talk about, that give you in the table format maybe a couple of financing rounds. So I'll just stand here so it's easier to point. So let's say now, okay, we have our 3 founders and there's 6 million total shares, and they were founder shares and they got them for a nominal amount of money. So maybe everybody was 2 million each. And we raised money from our, that's 100,000. So we raised money from friends and family, $100,000 at 25 cents, we got 400,000 shares. So pre-money value, post-money value, and you see the founder's ownership interest. And you're going to see the founder's ownership interest is going to be material as you see the impact of dilution over different financings. So it's at this point that we've received our $100,000 and we say, okay, now we have enough money to start hiring people, and we go back to our option discussion. So let's install an option plan. So we've decided that 1.5 million options in our pool is the right number, but on a non-diluted basis, the founders still own the same amount of the company. Next, we proceed to an angel investment. So we raised money at 35 cents. So this was our pre-money valuation, and this was our post-money valuation, obviously with 420. And the founder's ownership interest has decreased to that amount. The reason why I keep it at a non-diluted basis is because the friends and family, certainly, but also angels are the 2 financing points where it's more likely that an option pool will be excluded, although certainly we're seeing angels be very aggressive with including the option pool in the valuation. Then you have a Series A VC. So in our example, they're investing 1.5 million at 50 cents. They've chosen to include the option pool in the calculation that they arrived at. So they said, not only that, but we don't think that your pool is big enough, so we're going to make you add to it. So see how the founder's ownership interest goes down below 50 as a result of just these 3 financing for under $2 million, or just $2 million, sorry. And the resulting pre and post-money valuations. And like I said, we'll make all these slides available after the talk. And then finally, a Series B financing. So now we're raising at $1. You can see the resulting dilution to the founder on a fully diluted basis. Again, now we're raising with the stock option pool included. And although the founder's ownership interest on paper is worth that, now they only own 34% of the company. So that is, it's somewhat hard to put into, just circling around in your head when you're hearing about different concepts, dilution, things like that. So that this was just a very, very simple summary of picking numbers, what companies' financing life cycle might look like. Any questions?
Is pre-money just defined
how do you define pre-money? Is it the valuation before each next round, or is it before a particular type of round?
Yeah, before each round.
Okay.
Yeah, and then the pre-money value is impacted significantly by whether it's on a fully diluted basis, so including that pool or not. And there could be tons of other securities. Maybe you did a unit financing, there's warrants, you got to include the warrants and all sorts of things.
Yeah, on this one, it's basically taking the 6 million shares plus, you set everything at a dollar price, it's the 6 million shares, 400,000, the 1.2 million, the 3 million, and then the 2 million option plan. You know, assuming those are all worth $1, then your pre-money is 12.6 million, and post-money, you add the 5 million that the Series B put in.
That's us.
So I think we wanted to make sure we got through it, and we're happy to take on questions for a while. People have
All right,
questions.
well, it's just 2 o'clock, so if anyone needs to leave, go ahead. Otherwise, thank you very much. You guys finished on time, so it's a miracle. And whoever wants to stay for questions, we got the room for a while.
So let's say I sell angel investors a bunch of shares at $1 a share, but I want to allocate, you know, equity to some new members on the team via options. How must the strike price of those options be above $1, or options at a strike price of a nominal 5 cents a share?
There's corporate investor relations and tax aspects.
Yeah, I'll answer the tax bit. So this is going to depend on whether at that time your company is a CCPC or not. So if it's a CCPC and that person to whom you want to issue the options to is at arm's length of the company, then you can just give the options. You can
Arm's
give the options.
length. Can you define arm's length?
Just simply like not one of the founders and not somebody who has a large stake in the company already. Doesn't otherwise control it.
It's like somebody that comes in to help you make this thing happen, they're not going to take much of a salary.
Probably not arm's length. Oh, sorry, probably is arm's length.
Oh, it is arm's length.
Yeah.
So 5 cents a share would pass.
Yeah. So if it's not CCPC, then you're gonna have an issue because although you can issue whatever options, whatever, you can give shares to people, you can do whatever you want, but then the problem is gonna come when you try to get into the Section 7, like the stock option scheme under the Act. There, the non-CCPC, if you haven't actually issued the option at the strike price that's greater than the fair market value of the share at the time, then you're not gonna get the beneficial deduction. That's the limit. So that's something to be careful of.
And then I think the corporate law and investor relations aspects, if you took money from an investor and they're probably going to be pretty pissed off if you start issuing, options at 5 cents afterwards. Just you issue it at such a low price, you're not bringing in fair value for the stuff. So normally, many investors would, require that the stock, as part of their investment, that you adopt a stock option plan that says you will issue them at fair value or something like that, and not amend the stock option plan without their consent. And then, the other thing with corporate law is you're supposed to issue stock at fair value. So I know people do this from time to time for a variety of reasons, but if it's, done on an egregious basis, I think people would have the right to complain to other shareholders because it's not fair to them.
Yeah, my example was a little extreme, but part of what's underneath it is a question of, how generous can we be with value of even shares we give to other people on the team, new people that come in. Let's say you and I have been working on it for a year, new people come in, it must, even if we give them shares as opposed to options, must it be at quote fair market value? Even if you don't have investors, is there still an assumption that, say you're raising money from investors in another couple of months, that it has to kind of meet a straight line from zero to the investor's share price? You know what I mean?
Not a straight line, but I would say that the rules are there, like the guidelines are there for a reason. Like to give you an example, if your practice is, to issue options at a strike price that like detaches from fair market value, and then your team expands in the US, you start trying to issue options way below fair market value to US people, tons of pain. Tons of pain, right? So there's gonna be a whole bunch of reasons why there's rationale for that. You know, we've seen examples where on the eve of the financing, when you say, you know, we did it wrong, the founders breakdown shouldn't have been me 100, it should have been me 80, and, you know, person X 10 and person Y 10. And the investor goes, that's fine, but the pie doesn't change, so you surrender 20% of your shares to cancellation. And then you can backfill in, you know, through, you know, option grants or otherwise, with the founders to get equity at a set at, you know, that nominal price. But the ultimate impact on the financing is zero, right? So, you know, investors are, you know, often quite savvy to those kinds of issues. And as a founder, you have to be very careful.
Are there similar annual investment tax credits in other Canadian provinces? We have the Alberta.
Alberta basically copied our act and changed the name.
My understanding is that there is something in different provinces because like for income tax purposes, there's like all sorts of like income labor. And then I've noticed that there are like, in each province, there seems to be like some provision for venture. I don't know how good it is in the different provinces, but.
Yeah, and the, you know, the way they work, you know, so the BC company here is, you know, it's BC resident investors that can have the benefit of the tax credit. So like, if you have an Alberta resident investor, a BC tax credit doesn't help them because they're not paying taxes in BC. So, but, you know, it could be that they're eligible for something under the Alberta Act, and that, you know, whether or not a BC company can apply for an Alberta tax credit, you know, maybe in certain circumstances.
And the 30% tax credit is refundable. It's not applied to against income for a BC resident.
Then you do have to be a BC resident to get that.
So, did I understand correctly that as a founder, if I invest $25,000 at least in my own company, then I would qualify as a BC?
Can you meet the other criteria too?
Yes, assuming that that's the case.
Yeah.
Then I would.
Yeah, assuming you meet all the other criteria.
And then you've got, you know, and it's a great program. And you've got to go apply for the credits, and there's a pool, and there's only so many, so you've got to get your name on the list. And, you know, sometimes you'll hear at the end of February, oh, they're all gone, right? So, so it's, you know, you do need to apply to get them, but if you get them, they're great.
Investment Capital branch website's extremely user friendly, so all that information is pretty digestible.
Can employee stock options be traded?
No, and well, you know, so before you're a public company, not only can you only issue shares to people that made an exemption, people are only able to resell pursuant to an exemption. So, you know, an accredited investor could, you know, in theory, sell his stock in your company to another accredited investor. But that's the securities law aspect of it. The additional restrictions are that most companies, private company articles, while you're still a private issuer, they're going to say you can only transfer with approval of the board of directors. And most stock options plans will say the options are not transferable. So, you know, if the options are transferable under the plan and there's no shareholders agreement that says, you know, or restriction of their shares, and the articles, you know, permit that, and you're transferring to another person that has a securities law exemption, meaning another employee or a director or an officer or an accredited investor, then yes.
And would buyback of option be part of that definition?
The company repurchasing options? So that is permitted, it's normally permitted under the corporate law, and there's probably some tax-related aspect of dividend.
Yeah, there's going to be like a tax effectiveness. So when you like either transfer it or you have it repurchased, there's going to be an income. And so like whatever you get for that is going to be income at that time that you get it.
Anything else?
I think for me, let's just go back to that 2-year exemption rule about stock options. Like once you execute the stock option and you're given the stocks,
Within 2 years.
Within 2 years, but if the employee's no longer there after a year, where does that happen?
I think it's just be the shareholder.
Be the shareholder, not the employee.
Yeah, you can be a shareholder without being an employee unless the plan says otherwise.
Curious about stock options as far as drawing like, say somebody's fired for cause. How do you agree?
So in our, an option plan from us will have, all the bells and whistles around, the expiry date is such and such date, or it's accelerated to the date of termination, on termination for cause, or normally if it's termination not for cause, you'd have 30 days to exercise vested options. But you absolutely want to have it in there, something that, if you're terminated for cause, that the window comes down and even vested options aren't exercised, they immediately terminate at the point of termination for cause.
If somebody like an employer or a consultant exercises options, then the company gets some cash into the treasury, don't they?
Yeah.
So that's kind of a desirable event.
Yeah, I don't think normally companies issue options for fundraising purposes, but yeah, and that's, you get some money in through doing that. But it's normally to incentivize people to stick out for the long term.
Could you elaborate a bit on some of the negatives or potential drawbacks to taking or using a safe in a raise? I've heard a lot about it, I don't really know much about it in terms of how it compares, but it seems like a reasonably attractive option for an early raise.
Can you get EBC credit or EBC credits on a safe?
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
So that's the last one. Well, we were able to get it before, but now they've proved that it's pulled down, that you can get it.
One of the things before is you couldn't get the venture capital tax credits, I think, or it was unclear.
Yeah.
But
yeah, like the downside is one of two things. Many people will tell you it's a good thing for you to go through the pain of coming up with a valuation and doing a price round, right? Where you value your shares and you agree on a price. So the downside is you've kicked the can down the road on valuation. Really, that's a downside or not. If the only way you're going to get money now is through safe, that's not really a downside, right? You did what you had to do to get funded. I'd say the practical downside that we see is that oftentimes founders are stacking safes. So what I mean is they're getting a bunch of different things like safes that have a bunch of different conversion discounts or valuation caps. And the dilution that is eventually born on the future financing to the founders, sometimes they don't appreciate how big that is. So to use an example, if it's $100,000 and converts at a $1 million cap, and you go do a financing in the future at a $10 million valuation, because it's converting at a $1 million cap, the dilution